Greetings and welcome to Luca Sprues. In today's video, I build an Afrika Korps diorama from the figures included in the Tamiya 1/35 scale Panzer II. I began by cutting out the figures carefully from the sprue and then gluing them together with Revell Contact Professional. The figures are alright, definitely showing their age in some respects, but still perfectly usable and with some decent details still remaining. The four figures were put together. The fourth I decided to have running towards his machine gun rather than running while holding it, so I didn't glue that to him. While the figures dried, I glued some styrofoam packaging to form a rugged and rocky cliff face quite high up. I planned to add some trees and also have some water running down the rock faces. I carved some water lanes and placed a tree on the top of the cliff before I glued tissue paper to the styrofoam to create a natural looking surface with creases and folds to use for the ground. The tissue paper goes hard and brittle as it dries with the PVA, so it was also ideal to be painted on as long as you are careful and don't push too hard. I cleared away the excess paper and then added some extra trees before painting flat earth on the entire diorama base. Then, while that dried, I carefully cleaned up my figures of the flash from the sprue and the pin markings with a knife and a bit of sandpaper. Because they were older kits, they had a little bit more flash and pin markings, but that's easy enough to clean up with a steady hand. I scratch built from some spare pieces of plastic an ammunition box for the MG34 so that I could have it set up ready to fire on one of the lower rocks in the diorama. Next, I glued a couple of pieces of styrofoam and wrapped them in tissue paper and then placed them onto the ground. This was to create a couple of rocks. While the rocks dried, I then moved on to painting the figures. The first stage for me when painting figures is the uniform colour. I chose desert yellow for the shirts and also the helmets of the figures. Following this, I then painted the figures in 3 coats of slightly watered down flat flesh for their skin. I paint in thin layers rather than big sloppy layers so that you get the most out of the detail, and also you get a nice uniform finish in several layers. The figures' boots were painted red-brown, and then I painted the figures' pants. I decided to use different colours for different figures' pants to indicate different ages and weathering on the uniforms. So as a result, some were painted khaki drab, others in the more worn-out coat of buff, and some also in the desert yellow to match their shirts. With the base coats of paint applied, I then moved on to the accessories, which were painted a mix of colours. For the squad leader, I painted his webbing in khaki drab and his MP40 ammunition pouches in tank hull red. I also painted his helmet strap in tank hull red. For all the soldiers, I painted flat earth on their epaulets but later painted white so I could put some custom decals on them. I painted the soldiers' kit in a mix of different colours, primarily flat black, field grey, tank hull red, red brown, flat aluminium, khaki drab and also black. I used flat earth for various accessories such as the drinking water bottles, but also on the stocks of the MG34 and the rifles. I used flat aluminium and a very fine brush to achieve metallic weathering and chipping on the ammunition boxes and various equipment of the soldiers by applying it in a stippling motion with the fine brush. I also used it to achieve a metallic effect on the MP40 by painting it initially in totally flat aluminium and then following over with a coat of watered down flat black. I painted faces on the figure using a very small needle with paint dipped on the end and applied it over the raised surfaces of the lips and the eyes of the figures. I also dabbed a tiny bit of a different colour, such as medium blue or green for the eyes, and then added pupils with a layer of flat black, also using the needle as seen. After doing all the fine details, I painted any mistakes I made on the base colours of the skin and also the uniform using a very fine brush. I then painted the masking tape strips I'd made to make the weapon straps with khaki drab. I printed out some custom markings for the helmets, armbands and the different collar badges for the soldiers on clear decal paper, and then painted the areas that they would go on white so that I'd have a white backdrop. before neatening up and blending the decals in with the base layer of desert yellow. And now back to the diorama base, which off camera I painted the rocks in natural grey and the rest of the diorama in flat earth. I created variation in the rocks using dark grey on some areas and then dry brushing the rocks in flat white before moving on to applying PVA glue all over the dirty areas of the diorama and sprinkling some sand I got from the beach. To add some realism and variety, I glued some darker coloured dirt and some pieces of leaves and twigs to create the effect of debris getting flown down the cliff. I had glued down some larger rocks and pieces of sand to create the effect of rocks that had fallen down the cliff and broken up a little bit. I also added some decomposed leaf skeletons over the tree branches to create some branching effects for the foliage to cling to. I glued one layer of foliage using PVA glue to the decomposing leaf structures and the tree, and then I added some foliage on top of that. While that's set, I moved back to painting the figures. I wanted to make my figures dirty so they blended in with their environment, so I gave them all a wash of flat black. This is done by simply taking some acrylic paint and mixing it with water so that it flows into the cracks. I then glued down my figures into their respective places so they looked like they were running to combat and setting up a bit of a perimeter on the cliff face. One crew member was carrying ammunition towards his MG34, which I glued down separately and added some extra detail. I glued down the ammunition box carrying figure's canteen and drink bottle next to the machine gun to make it look like a small emplacement he'd been stationed at for a little while. I then painted the machine gun a mix of flat black and flat aluminium, and I also decided to add some ammunition belts being fed into the gun by using some of the masking tape from the box between the gun and gluing down thin pieces of copper wire. Gluing the copper wire was a fiddly process, but I liked the extra detail it added by showing the individual bullets being fed into the gun. After the last few details were painted, I added on some of AK Interactive's still water into the ravines and cracks in the rocks to create some puddles of water flowing down the hill, as if it had rained earlier. This water-based product is very easy to use to create small puddles and water effects. However, I should have considered it might get a little bit absorbed into the sand, dirt, the styrofoam and also the paper. However, I still liked the effect it created, especially making the rocks look extra wet. And with that, my diorama was complete after just painting the masking tape that framed the edge flat black. I had a lot of fun doing this little project, and I plan to do a few more dioramas in the future, especially at this larger scale, which was my first time ever doing it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope it was inspiring and informative, and please leave your suggestions and anything you'd like to ask in the comments below. Shout out to our loyal patrons Archie, Imo and Joan Moss for funding this video, and for Jack McKibben for giving me these soldiers and the tank to paint. Thank you very much for watching, take care and model on.